They didn't leave me all at once. They erased me slowly, not with anger, not with cruelty, with indifference. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 46 years old, and for most of my adult life, I existed on the edges of other people's lives, present but never central, included but never essential. I didn't realize how disposable I had become until I stopped being useful. My husband, Evan Brooks, was the first to walk away. Not dramatically, not loudly. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply decided his life no longer needed me in it. We had been married for 22 years, long enough to build routines that felt permanent, long enough to mistake familiarity for loyalty. Evan was well-liked, charming in a way that made people feel chosen when he spoke to them. At dinners, he held court. At gatherings, he told stories. I sat beside him, smiling when appropriate, laughing when expected. People often describe me as sweet. That word followed me for years. Sweet, supportive, quiet. No one ever said formidable. I didn't interrupt. I didn't compete. I listened, and I thought listening mattered. Evan worked in commercial real estate, a world built on handshakes, impressions, and proximity to power. I helped more than anyone realized. I remembered names, tracked relationships, prepared him for meetings without him ever noticing I was doing it. When someone's spouse was ill, I reminded Evan to reach out. When a deal fell through, I adjusted schedules to soften the fallout. I wasn't on the contracts, but I was in the margins of every success. His family liked me, or at least they liked how easy I was. I never challenged opinions, never made things uncomfortable. At holidays, I cooked. At events, I cleaned up quietly. I didn't demand attention, and over time, that became my identity. The woman who required nothing, which made it easy to forget what I contributed. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived disguised as progress. Evan started getting invited to things I wasn't. Just a work dinner, he'd say. Or, it's mostly networking. I didn't argue. I never wanted to be the reason he declined opportunity. Then came the subtle comments. "You're so low maintenance," his sister once said, smiling. I smiled back. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Evan changed gradually. New clothes, new habits, a new impatience I couldn't quite name. When I spoke, he listened less. When I offered insight, he brushed past it. Not dismissively, just efficiently, as if my input was optional. The night he told me he wanted to separate, he didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway of our living room, keys still in his hand. "I think we've grown in different directions," he said. There was no tension in his voice, no urgency, just finality. I remember noticing how calm he looked, like someone who had already grieved privately. "What does that mean?" I asked. He sighed lightly. "I don't feel like myself anymore," he said, "and I think I need space to figure that out." Space, that word again. I asked him if there was someone else. He shook his head. "I'm not doing this for anyone else," he said. "I'm doing it for me." I believed him. That was my first mistake. He moved out within a week, not because we fought, because he was organized, efficient, prepared. His family reacted quickly, too quickly. His mother called me 2 days later. She spoke kindly, but distantly. "Evan needs support right now," she said. "He's going through a lot." I waited for her to ask how I was. She didn't. Friends stopped reaching out, not immediately, gradually. Invitations slowed, group chats quieted. When I did hear from people, the tone had shifted. Careful, neutral, like they were navigating a situation they didn't want to understand. At a mutual friend's birthday dinner, I wasn't invited. I only found out because I saw the photos afterward. Evan was there, smiling, relaxed, seated at the center of the table, people I had cooked for, celebrated with, listened to for years. No one looked uncomfortable. No one seemed to notice my absence. That was the moment it hit me. They hadn't chosen sides. They had chosen convenience. Evan was still useful to their world. I wasn't. It wasn't personal. That was the most painful part. It was structural. I became someone people didn't need to account for. When Evan introduced someone new into his life, it happened seamlessly. Her name was Claire. She appeared in photos first, then at events, then at family gatherings I no longer attended. She fit easily, laughed loudly, spoke confidently. She took up space, and no one questioned it. I didn't hate her. I barely thought about her, because she wasn't the one who erased me. The erasure had already happened. She was just stepping into the gap. The weeks after the separation blurred together, not with chaos, with quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you question your own existence. No one called to ask what I needed. No one asked what I planned to do next. They assumed I would adjust, that I would figure it out, that I would disappear gracefully. And for a while, I did. I stopped reaching out, stopped offering help, stopped filling silences. I watched, I paid attention, and that's when I realized something unsettling. My absence didn't create chaos, it created exposure. People had grown used to me smoothing edges, managing emotions, preventing discomfort. Without me, small frictions surfaced, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to notice. Conversations stalled. Plans fell apart. Misunderstandings lingered longer than they used to. I wasn't missed. I was felt. And there is a difference. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't post cryptic messages or share my pain publicly. I stayed quiet. Because silence, when chosen, becomes power. They treated me like I was disposable. And instead of fighting to prove my worth, I decided to let them experience the cost. Silence isn't empty. It's revealing. Once I stopped filling the gaps, patterns emerged. Not dramatic ones, practical ones. I began to see who benefited most from my presence, and who benefited even more from my disappearance. Evan's life moved forward quickly on the surface. New routines, new social rhythms, a new woman by his side. But beneath that movement there was friction, subtle at first, a meeting rescheduled twice, a dinner canceled last minute, a misunderstanding that lingered longer than it should have. These weren't disasters, they were inefficiencies. And inefficiency is where dependence hides. I noticed it during a phone call from Evan's sister, Marianne. She hadn't called me since the separation. Her voice was overly pleasant. "How are you holding up?" she asked. It sounded rehearsed. "I'm fine," I replied. A pause. "That's good," she said quickly. "Listen, I was wondering if you still had the contact information for the caterer we used last Thanksgiving." I smiled. "I might," I said. Another pause. "But I'm not sure where it is." "Oh," she said. "Well, if you find it, let me know." "I will," I replied. I never did. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Marianne hadn't called because she missed me. She had called because something wasn't working, and she assumed I would fix it. That assumption repeated itself. Evan's mother texted one afternoon, "Do you remember what wine Evan prefers with lamb?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "No, that was a lie." But it was also a boundary. Friends reached out with vague messages. "We should catch up sometime. Thinking of you." None of them asked direct questions. None of them acknowledged the absence. They wanted access to the version of me that made their lives easier, not the version that required honesty. I started noticing how often my name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. I heard about it through others. She always knew how to handle things. She was so organized. I don't know how she did it. They spoke about me in past tense, as if I were a function, not a person. And that's when it became clear. My silence wasn't making me invisible. It was exposing who had been leaning on me without consent. Evan struggled more than he admitted. He called once, late at night, not angry, confused. "Did you always manage the property taxes?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Oh," he replied. "I didn't realize." I didn't respond, because realization doesn't need commentary. He called again a week later. "This whole thing feels more complicated than I expected," he said. "It always was," I replied. Another pause. "Why does it feel harder now?" he asked. "Because you're doing it yourself," I thought. But I didn't say that. I let him sit with the discomfort. Lauren tried to step into my role. I could tell. She organized dinners, sent group messages, tried to create cohesion, but she didn't know the history, the sensitivities, the quiet agreements that had been built over years. She was proactive, but she wasn't intuitive, and people noticed. Not because she failed, but because I had made it look effortless. Effortless systems are dangerous. They make people forget the work behind them. Lauren assumed the silence meant I was gone, that the role was vacant. She didn't realize the role had never been officially acknowledged. It had just existed. And now that it didn't, everything felt slightly off. I observed more, spoke less. I paid attention to reactions instead of words. Who hesitated before responding to messages? Who double-checked plans that used to flow easily? Who became irritable in situations I had once smoothed over? It wasn't about me, it was about stability. And stability had been outsourced to my presence. Evan's social circle began shifting, not dramatically, gradually. People stopped deferring to him automatically. Conversations required more effort. Decisions took longer. He wasn't less capable. He was just unsupported. And support, when invisible, is often mistaken for weakness. Lauren sensed it. She asked questions Evan couldn't answer. "Why does everyone seem tense?" she asked once, according to a mutual acquaintance. "Why do I feel like I'm missing something?" Evan didn't know, because he had never asked how things worked before. He had just enjoyed the result. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt validation. There's a difference. I wasn't celebrating anyone's discomfort. I was understanding my own value, and that understanding was grounding. I started rebuilding my life deliberately, not out of revenge, out of self-respect. I updated my professional profile, reached out to contacts I had maintained quietly over the years, people I had supported without expectation. They remembered me. Immediately, they asked real questions, offered real opportunities, because relationships built on mutual respect don't disappear when circumstances change. I began receiving invitations again, not from the old circle, from a new one, people who saw me as a contributor, not a convenience. Meanwhile, Evan's world continued to wobble. He wasn't failing, he was adjusting. An adjustment is uncomfortable when you're used to being carried. One evening, he said something revealing. "I didn't think you'd just—" "Stop," he said. "Stop what?" I asked. "Everything," he replied. I considered that. "I didn't stop," I said. "I stepped back." There was a long silence. You were always there, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. And you never asked why. That was the moment he began to understand. Not emotionally, logistically. He had mistaken my reliability for permanence. Lauren began pulling away. Not emotionally, strategically. She asked more questions, challenged assumptions, wanted clarity. She hadn't signed up to manage chaos. She had signed up for a finished system. And now she was realizing she had inherited something incomplete. I remained silent, not because I didn't care, but because silence had become my language, and it was speaking louder than confrontation ever could. People benefit from silence until it stops serving them. Then they call it distance, coldness, change. But the truth is simpler. Silence reveals dependency. And once revealed, it can't be unseen. By the end of that year, everyone knew something had shifted. No one said it outright, but the ease was gone, the fluidity, the invisible glue, and they began to ask the wrong question. What happened to Natalie, instead of the right one? How much was Natalie holding together? I didn't answer, because the answer was unfolding on its own, and in that unfolding I learned something powerful. Being overlooked is painful, but being underestimated, that's an advantage. People don't notice collapse when it begins. They notice it when it becomes inconvenient. For a long time, Evan's world looked intact from the outside. Photos still appeared online, events were still attended, smiles were still performed, but the energy had shifted. Less confidence, more explanation, less authority, more justification. I noticed it before anyone else, because I had lived inside his rhythm for over 2 decades. I knew when something was off long before it showed. The first public crack appeared at a dinner I wasn't invited to. A mutual friend called me the next morning, not to gossip, to ask a question. Did Evan always interrupt people like that? She asked carefully. I paused. No, I said. He never had to. She exhaled. He talked over 3 people, she continued. Lauren tried to redirect him, but it was awkward. Awkward. That word followed Evan now. He had always relied on timing, on instinct, on knowing when to speak and when to listen. Those instincts had never been his. They had been learned, absorbed, borrowed, and without me quietly guiding the flow, his presence became heavy. Too much. At work, the pressure increased. Lauren mentioned it once, indirectly, during another unexpected encounter. I ran into her at a charity fundraiser I attended with a colleague. She looked relieved to see a familiar face, even if that face was mine. Evan's under a lot of scrutiny lately, she said, lowering her voice. He's trying to adjust. Adjust to what? I asked. She hesitated. To everything, she said. I nodded. She glanced around the room, then leaned closer. He keeps saying things used to be easier, she admitted, that things ran smoother. I smiled faintly. They did, I said. She studied my face. You're not angry, she said. No, I replied. I'm realistic. That unsettled her. People expect anger from women who have been replaced. Anger makes the narrative comfortable. Silence forces questions. Lauren didn't ask them out loud, but they were forming. Evan began canceling plans. Not because he was busy, because he was overwhelmed. He stopped attending optional events, then semi-mandatory ones. Then he arrived late to the ones he couldn't avoid. Each absence was small, but absence compounds. At home, Lauren tried to recreate what she thought stability looked like. She hosted dinners, organized weekends, suggested routines. But she didn't know which details mattered. And Evan didn't know either. That had always been my role. One evening, Evan called me again. Not defensive this time, frustrated. I don't understand why everything feels so complicated, he said. It didn't used to. I let the silence sit, then said, It was complicated. You just didn't see it. He laughed bitterly. You make it sound like I was helpless. No, I replied. I make it sound like you were supported. Another pause. I didn't realize how much you did, he admitted. That was the closest thing to truth he had offered me in years. I know, I said. He sighed. I thought replacing you would simplify things. There it was. I replaced a person, he continued. But I didn't replace the system. I closed my eyes briefly. You can't replace what you never understood, I said. He didn't respond, and that silence was different. He wasn't defiant. He was lost. Meanwhile, Lauren began pulling away. Not emotionally, strategically. She asked more questions, challenged assumptions, wanted clarity Evan couldn't provide. She hadn't signed up for confusion. She had signed up for a finished product. And now she was realizing she had inherited an unfinished structure. Cracks appeared socially next. A colleague declined Evan's proposal during a meeting, not aggressively, just firmly. Someone else stepped in to clarify his point. That had never happened before. Evan had always been deferred to. Now he was being corrected. Lauren noticed the shift, because power dynamics are easy to spot once you expect them. At a dinner party, someone asked Evan a question about an initiative he had once led. He hesitated. Lauren answered instead. The room adjusted its attention accordingly. That night, Evan drank too much. Lauren left early, alone. He texted me later. I feel invisible. I stared at the message, then typed back. That's what it feels like when the structure you leaned on is gone. He didn't reply. The truth is, I wasn't enjoying this. Not the way people imagine revenge should feel. There was no thrill, no triumph, just inevitability. Watching someone slowly realize that the life they thought was theirs had been quietly maintained by someone they dismissed. I began receiving calls from people who hadn't spoken to me in months, not to reconnect, to understand. How did you keep everything together? One asked. You always seemed so calm, another said. I answered honestly. I paid attention, I told them. Lauren stopped attending events with Evan. When she did attend, she stayed close to her phone, distracted, detached. She had stopped presenting as his extension, and that was dangerous for him, because Evan didn't know how to perform alone. One afternoon, Evan showed up again, not unannounced this time. He asked first. I agreed. He sat across from me in the living room. Same posture, less confidence. I'm tired, he said. I nodded. Being admired is exhausting when you don't know why you're admired, I said. He winced. I didn't mean to discard you, he said. Yes, you did, I replied calmly. You just didn't mean to feel the consequences. He stared at the floor. Lauren thinks I need a coach, he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. For what? For presence, he admitted. I almost smiled. Almost. Because presence can't be taught when it was borrowed. What do you want from me? I asked. He hesitated. Guidance, he said. Perspective. I leaned back. You replaced me overnight, I said. You don't get to consult me slowly. That landed. He stood to leave shortly after. At the door, he paused. You always knew this would happen, he said. Yes, I replied. How? Because I knew what I was holding together, I said. And you didn't. When the door closed, I felt something shift inside me. Not satisfaction, completion. Because the cracks were no longer invisible. They were visible to everyone now. And the more visible they became, the less Evan could pretend. People assume consequences arrive loudly. They imagine confrontation, arguments, explosions. But the most permanent consequences arrive quietly. They arrive as adjustments. Evan didn't lose his life overnight. He lost access. Access to ease. Access to forgiveness. Access to the invisible labor that had made his world feel stable. Once the cracks became public, the recalibration began. Not cruelly, professionally. At work, Evan was no longer deferred to. He was consulted. And there's a difference. Consultation implies doubt. Authority implies trust. He found himself explaining decisions he once made instinctively, reassuring people who once assumed competence, answering questions that never used to be asked. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. It was procedural. Lauren noticed before he did, because admiration sharpens attention, but disappointment sharpens perception. She stopped defending him, stopped reframing his missteps, stopped smoothing the tension he created in rooms that used to welcome him. She didn't confront him. She observed, the same way I once had. One evening, Evan called me again. Not late, not emotional, just tired. I don't think she respects me, he said quietly. I didn't respond right away. What makes you say that? I asked. She corrects me, he said, in front of people. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. That's what happens when authority isn't supported by structure, I said. There was a long silence. You always knew when to step in, he said, when to smooth things over. Yes, I replied, and you never asked how. That silence weighed heavier than any argument we'd ever had, because it carried a truth he couldn't undo. Lauren left 3 weeks later, not dramatically, no fight, no announcement. She packed her things while Evan was at work, left a note on the counter, short, polite, final. She didn't accuse him. She didn't explain herself. She simply removed herself from something that no longer aligned with her expectations. Evan came home to an apartment that felt unfamiliar, because it had never been stabilized. It had only been decorated. He called me that night. I didn't answer. He texted. I think she's gone. I didn't respond, because this part of the story didn't need my voice. Reality was speaking clearly enough. At work, the scrutiny escalated, quietly. The informal feedback became formal, not hostile, administrative. His name appeared less often in proposals. He was asked to support rather than lead. Meetings he once dominated no longer waited for his input. The shift was undeniable, and people noticed, not with sympathy, with recalibration. They adjusted their expectations of him, which is far more damaging than rejection. Evan tried to recover. He reached out to old contacts, scheduled lunches, proposed initiatives. But momentum doesn't respond to desperation. It responds to trust, and trust had eroded. He had mistaken visibility for value. When visibility faded, there was nothing beneath it. I heard about his professional demotion through a mutual acquaintance. No one said it directly. They didn't need to. The tone changed. Things are different for him now. Different is what people say when the truth feels impolite. Evan showed up at my house one final time. He looked older, not because time had passed, because illusion had lifted. I know I don't have the right, he said, standing on the porch, but I need to understand something. I folded my arms, calm. What? I asked. How did you hold everything together for so long? He said. Without anyone noticing. I studied him, because that question mattered. I noticed, I said. He frowned, but no one else did. That's the point, I replied. He looked down. I thought replacing you would give me freedom, he said quietly. I nodded. You thought I was weight, I said. Not balance. He swallowed. I didn't see you, he admitted. No, I said. You saw what I provided. That landed differently. He didn't argue, didn't defend, just stood there with the understanding settling in. I'm tired, he said. Yes, I replied, because now you're carrying your own life. He left shortly after, and I felt no need to follow him with my eyes, because my attention had already shifted forward. I didn't rebuild loudly, I rebuilt intentionally. I refined my routines, expanded my professional reach, reconnected with people who knew me beyond the role I played in Evan's life. I stopped shrinking to keep peace, stopped smoothing edges that weren't mine to manage. And slowly, quietly, my life became lighter, not because I had lost something, because I had stopped carrying what wasn't acknowledged. Evan faded, not from existence, from relevance, which is far more painful. He still existed, he just no longer mattered in the spaces that once defined him. Months later, I saw him across a room at a networking event, standing alone, checking his phone, waiting for someone to notice him. No one did, and I realized something important. The man who treated me like I was disposable had never replaced what I did, because what I did wasn't visible. It was foundational, and foundations don't announce themselves when they're gone. They let structures fall. The irony is this. Evan thought he was upgrading his life. What he actually did was remove the stabilizer. He mistook novelty for strength, attention for authority, replacement for progress. And I let him. Because the most effective revenge isn't exposure, it's absence. Absence of protection, absence of correction, absence of emotional labor. When you stop holding someone together, they have to learn who they are alone. And not everyone survives that lesson intact. I didn't win because he failed. I won because I stopped trying to be essential to someone who never learned how to see me. They treated me like I was disposable. I let them learn the cost. And unlike them, I didn't need anyone to notice.